We'll take a look tonight first at the code for the exercises in Chapter 5 that you did last Thursday night. This is the beginning of week 6. After this week, 2 more weeks and spring break, and for you, the end of the Oracle class, and then potentially the beginning of the advanced database class. So real quickly, we'll take a look at the code and some of the settings from Chapter 5. Again, you can look at this a little more online as much as you want. These are the preferences from the setup that we talked about. Here's some of the code. This is 3.1 and the results. This is doing the selection at 5-5 and the results. Again, 5 was working with views. This is 13. And this is the constraints, which I don't think I gave your class as an assignment. So you're lucky you got to bypass this one. Tonight we get into Chapter 6, and that is more detail on creating your own tables. And we'll actually do this Thursday night in class. If Lee is correct, or next Tuesday night in class, depending on what the storm is like, or if the storm's that bad, a week from Thursday, we'll see. But Chapter 6, we're going to get into the details on creating your own table. When we first create a table, obviously there won't be any rows associated with that table. We haven't put in any data. A quick refresher, we use the keywords create table, then the table name, and then we outline our table by using column names or attributes and the actual data type that that attribute will contain. Some common errors that we see as people create tables, first of all, the opening and closing parentheses seem to get forgotten, more the ending parentheses than the opening. Also, people tend to forget the commas after the data types for each of the attributes. Of course, there wouldn't be one for the very last attribute in your table. And the other thing people tend to forget is the semicolon at the end of the table statement. Those are most of the common errors. Misspellings of data type crop up periodically, and reusing an attribute or table name tends to occur every once in a while. So you kind of have to keep your eye on what you're doing. Again, as we talked about last week, if you've got a good plan on how you're going to develop your database, it'll work a whole lot smoother. Next, we get into primary keys. And a primary key, as you will recall, is a unique identifier for each entity instance within a table. Now, they can be assigned when the table is first created or after the table is created. Remember, if you do it after the table's created, you're going to have to go in and assign a primary key to all of those existing entity instances that don't have primary keys. We can look at that a little bit later. Table and data constraints consist of more than just primary keys. We may have a value in a table, even though it's not a primary key, that can never be null. We always want it filled in. Some of our data constraints can include making an entry only a character string or only a numeric value. Or we can set up to where data entry can be within a range of numbers or within a specific range of characters. So we've got a variety of constraints that we can include as we create our table and as we go through and add our primary and auxiliary constraints. This is on page 221. You might take a look. There's a table in that area where you can look in a little more detail on how those constraints may be used. Here's an example of a table creation. Very simple. We see our keywords. We're running through and we take a look at the different data types that we have in use. Notice in line 3 where we're talking about a menu item, we can have from 0 to 99 menu items because we're showing the number we'll have 2. Notice in the varchar, we have anywhere between 3 and 20 character strings. Again, a varchar is a pretty good way to go because Oracle will only reserve the space it takes for that specific attribute based on what you're entering. And in the case of a description there at line 6, you could enter up to 20 characters. Price, a little different way to annotate the number. And what that's telling us is there are 4 numbers associated with price. 2 of those numbers are to the right of the decimal point. So in this case, the price for our menu items could be up to $99.99. The same with price increase. Technique, many people will put their semicolon at the end of the last attribute for the table. I like to put mine down on the line below, and it's just a habit that I got into several years ago. The way you do it is the best way for you. Here's an example then of the columns that we just created with the section 601 foods. Notice the column line on this data grid goes 1 through 6, and this is actually the order that we enter those columns in. You'd be surprised how many times that as the columns are used, they're not necessarily used in the order that they are entered. Some other things you can tell about by quickly bringing up the columns on the data grid. You can look at all of the column names. You can look at all of the data types. You can tell whether or not a column has a primary key or a constraint. The other thing we haven't talked about, and we really don't go into any detail on, is you can actually add comments in about each of the attributes that you're creating. The times that I've used this, I've done it out of SQL Developer and added those comments about the attribute in after I've actually created the column. When we look at data types, we talked a little bit about this before. But it's the data in the computer, and remember, that's all represented by 1s and 0s anyway. But the data types we're concerned about with Oracle are listed in the table on 214, and it talks about some of the errors that can occur as you use the different data types. A couple things to keep in mind. For a varchar 2, we can go up to 4,000 characters. That could be 4,000 numbers or 4,000 characters or 4,000 alphanumeric characters if we like. A car, we can enter up to 2,000 characters for each attribute that's defined as a car. Again, remember the big difference between a varchar and a car. A car will always reserve 2,000 characters even though you may only enter 3 characters for that attribute. A varchar will only reserve space for and use the number of characters assigned to that specific attribute. We also have clobs, and that's up to 4 gigabytes of characters. So yes, you could take part of your favorite book and actually store it in an Oracle database. A blob, on the other hand, is up to 4 gigabytes of binary data. So you can actually store music and video in your Oracle database if that's your desire. Hasn't always been that way. Clogs started off very small and have grown, and blogs were added about 10 years ago, as I recall. So some nice options for us as we create our data. Number, when we actually define a number, if we want to use the correct terms, we're talking about precision and then scale. Precision is the total numbers that number attribute will represent. The scale, again, is the number to the right of the digits. And we saw that defined just a couple of slides ago. Date, Oracle always handles a date as day, month spelled out as a character string with 3 letters, and then year as a 2-letter year. Now, we can go in and multiply this any way we want to within the confines of the Oracle definition of dates, to where we might want to spell the month out, we might want to have a 4-character year, we may want to add the actual day of the week to that date statement. All of that can be done in Oracle. Some of it we'll take a look at in this course, but we'll look at a little more of it when we get into Advanced Database. Note also under date, that's where we include our hours, minutes, and seconds. And we can do that in a normal format with an AM or PM designator, or we can set Oracle up to run as a 24-hour or a military time or a Greenwich time clock. Also remember, we discussed way back at the beginning of the semester that if you don't enter a time value for Oracle, Oracle automatically adopts 1 minute after midnight as the time for the actual hours, minutes, and seconds time for that date attribute. So it's a gotcha that can happen every once in a while. We can also use a process called timestamp that'll allow us to timestamp events that happen within Oracle. Again, the definition is pretty much the same. And again, we can go out to fractions of a second should we need to be that precise. Page 219 shows you some examples of how to load data into tables. We've already looked at one. There are several different ways to do it. Again, I'll put in my soapbox comment. Don't go in and enter your data manually in a data grid. Eventually, it's going to get you into trouble. Page 223, 2 ways to enter data into the table. The insert statement, and we're actually inserting literal values, and we're adding a row at a time. Another is with a select statement where we can add several rows of data at once. Normally, we'll look at a select statement as being used where we're moving data or parts of data from one table to another. Normally, that's the only time you would use that select statement. Here's an example. Insert into, and we've got our table, and then a query. We worked with this last week in Chapter 5 to do some data updates and to create some views and tables. So it's pretty much the same whether or not you're creating a view or a table when you use that type of statement. Here's the results. And we can take a look then at page 225, and this is really good code to study. It shows you some different ways to create a table. We also look at altering a table with constraints, and then again some more examples of data entry. We do really very little data entry because of the time it takes for you to create the data statements and run them in, but I will give you some experience with that on Thursday night. I want you to think back when we looked at Chapter 5, and when we look at an insert statement, what can we tell just by looking at the insert statement and the data that's being inserted? And remember, what you can tell by an insert statement is whether or not you are inserting data into all of the attributes in the table or just selected attributes. Let's take a little closer look at primary keys. Remember, we said earlier this evening that they could be added at any time. It's just one type of a constraint that we can assign against an Oracle table. And also keep in mind that a table can have only one primary key. Now, when we talk about a table having only one primary key, people get confused where we have a table that contains foreign keys that will list multiple primary keys, either for the same entity instance or for multiple entity instances, and that's all right. What we're talking about here is a unique entity instance that's going to be identified by a specific primary key, and that primary key will be used one time and one time only within that table. Composite keys, I try to stay away from these, the reason being that they are a combination of two different attributes within a table. And the problem comes when potentially one of those attributes can be changed. When that happens, then your composite key is off. One of the things we haven't talked in a lot of detail about is altering a table, and we will take a look at that, but notice that a commit is not required after you do an alter table. So when you conduct an alter table event, that's automatically going to change your database and do whatever you've told it to do. And we'll look at a couple of those later. Here's an alter table event. We're adding the constraint. We're naming it PK. Remember, we talked about that last week. Primary key. It's just an aid for you as you look at the different attributes associated with the table, and this is a primary key made up of the supplier ID and the product code. I'm not a fan of this one. This would be a composite key, but sometimes you have to use them. When we look at the results, you can see that there it is. It's added as a primary key, and it's required. It has to be there, and that's the third column over where it says nullable, and we list no for the supplier and the supplier ID and the product code. Both of those are combined to make our primary key, so both of those have to have a value like that. Here's another alter table option that we can take a look at, and we are dropping a constraint in this case, and it's the primary key that we just created. Another where we drop the where we add a constraint back in, and we're adding in the constraint primary key for as a menu item. So in this case, this would be a little more preferable to a composite key. Again, we take a look at the data and we can see how that has changed. And notice now we only have one attribute that is not nullable, and that is our menu item. One of the things that you can think about is potentially you could have a supplier ID for a short period of time that did not have a value associated with it. And if that was the case, then using this table, you wouldn't be able to make additional entries until you got that supplier's ID. So again, composite keys, there are places for them, but I highly, highly recommend you use them sparingly. One of the other things we haven't talked about is the ability to add attributes to a table after the table has been created and populated. So this can be done at any time. One of the key things to remember is that it's always positioned at the end of the table, and when you add that column, every instance will be null. That kind of surprises people at times. The code for it is very simple. Again, an alter table statement, add whatever the attribute is that you're adding, and then you define the data type right after it. So in this case, in line 3, we're adding a date, and we can see that the data type is date. We can also go in and we can modify attributes to make them larger or smaller. In this case, we're modifying in line 4 the attribute description, and we're changing the varchar2 size up to 25. Now, this can be a gotcha, because let's say our table originally was defined with description being a varchar2 of 20 characters. In this case, that would add 5 spaces at the end of each entity instance for the description that we're looking at. That's good. Let's say, though, that the table description was originally 50 characters, and we decided to cut it off and make it 25. Then those other 25 characters, once you go ahead and run this code, are gone forever. And remember, we talked about a couple of slides ago, alter table functions do not require a commit. So this is another way that Oracle tries and gets even with us. If we slip and forget which way we're going in modifying an attribute, it can be very, very detrimental to our database. Let's go a little further. Here we are, and we are modifying the price. And if you'll remember, originally our price was 4,2, and now we've changed it to 7,2. I have yet to see a cafeteria where I would want to pay, what, $10,000 or up to $10,000 for food. Yeah. Definitely not here on campus. Let's leave it at that. That's probably safer. And again, we can take a look at the data grid and see what happens as we add and we change this information. Notice we've got the description at 25 bytes now as a varchar2, and we've upped the price to 7 characters with 2 characters to the right of the decimal. If that wasn't good enough for you, we can also go through and we can delete columns from a table, and this can cause you an equal amount of headache. You need to make sure that this is exactly what you want to do. Again, this is one of those alter table functions that does not require a commit. So there is no oops. Once you run the code to drop a column, the column and all of its data are gone forever. And that can become a very, very serious problem. Now, we look at how that's done right here, and we dropped price increase off of our section 613 food table. And that is pretty much the end of chapter 6. What I like to do with chapter 6 is give you experience in creating and populating tables. So I'll have a couple of exercises for you on Thursday night when you come in and do it. If you would like those exercises early, let me know. I'll email them to you, and you can email them back to me by Thursday night at 8:20. Any questions?